Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 158. We're talking about Iran. Brian, we almost went to a war within the past couple weeks, right?
Which time?
Yeah, which time? We're losing track of how many.
It seems like we're always right on the threshold.
And Trump pulled us back, and it's been quite the ordeal. Here to help us understand what is going on, why are we almost going to war against Iran again with all the saber rattling, is Gareth Porter. He is an independent historian and journalist. He's the author of a book, Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare, which we will link to on today's show notes page, societyandthestate.com/158. Gareth, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Connor. Glad to be on your show.
So Brian was just mentioning, in jest, of course, but maybe not too much, that, you know, which time is this? And here we go again, right? So maybe bring our listeners up to speed, because this saber rattling happens a lot. There's been this incident or this exchange in the past few weeks where we almost went to war, or rather military action was almost carried out in Iran. What's this most recent sparring or altercation that led to that?
Yes, that was a specific incident that was the result of a U.S. drone, which was in the vicinity of Iran, in the Strait of Hormuz, which was shot down by an Iranian missile. And the advisors of President Trump had suggested and strongly supported a U.S. military retaliation. And Trump had, in fact, at least provisionally or conditionally approved the idea of a retaliatory strike. But he had been told, according to his own account, that such a strike would risk at least the possibility of as many as 150 casualties. And he decided in the end, according to his own account again, that he did not want to carry out a military strike with that many casualties because it would be not really proportional to the shoot down of the drone, which after all is an unmanned aerial vehicle.
So how you said several times right there, Gareth, that according to Trump's own account and according to his story, how are our listeners? How am I to know what is actually happening? You're going in there doing these investigations, trying to kind of peel back the onion layers and see what's going on. Is that account credible? How do we know what is actually happening when it comes to these foreign policy altercations?
Well, I can't say that it's completely incredible by any means. It's certainly plausible that, in fact, that was his reason for making the decision in the final analysis not to carry out the strike. However, I think that it's certainly equally or more plausible that there could be other explanations for his decision against going to war. One possibility, which would certainly be in character for Trump, is that he was always very skeptical about carrying out that attack over downing of a drone, and that being a showman as he is, he had the thought that it would be much more spectacular, and he would get more credit if, in fact, he waited until the very last moment, as it were, and then said, "No, I can't do this," based on the casualties. Now it is true. I mean, apparently, the part of the story that involves the estimate appears to be true, that there was an estimate given to him that there could be as many as 150 casualties. Although some people who were in favor of the strike said, well, that seems very unlikely because it would be carried out at night. Now, that in itself, of course, is revealing, because with the kind of tension between the United States and Iran at this point, it would make hardly any difference at all. I think it's fair to say whether a strike took place in the middle of the night or during the daytime, because the Iranians are going to be on full alert constantly. So, he would be right to suspect that some of his more warlike advisors were trying to tell him that this was safer or less costly in terms of human life than it really was. In any case, I think what this story really does bring out is that Trump does have a side of him which is skeptical about the advice that he has been getting from certainly Bolton, Pompeo, and others who would favor that kind of strike.
So Gareth, if I can intervene right there, I have a question.
Sure.
It's been interesting to me looking at the advisors Trump and the secretaries and the people he's appointed to be in charge of, the Department of Education and Interior. In so many instances, these are people who are fundamentally hostile in a lot of ways to the mission of these organizations, these government agencies that they are now tasked with overseeing. It's very interesting to see that intentional friction that's been created. Why is he keeping, do you suppose, these advisors, these war military advisors who are not at all hostile? They are, John Bolton and Pompeo, but especially John Bolton, and I'd love you to help our listeners understand why this is, as I'm describing, that he is kind of consistently advocating for intervention in war. But first, to start, why do you think he is allowing these people who've been advocating this that foreign hostility and this neoconservative approach to foreign policy, why are they still in his orbit and in his ear?
Well, that obviously is a key question, and very much goes to the heart of the Trump administration, and in this case, of his foreign policy. I think the answer is pretty clear, and that is that it goes back to his 2016 presidential election campaign, where he was really indebted to two sources of support. One was the Christian Zionist movement in the United States, because I don't know how many people listening to this will recall this, but Trump really became the favorite, the one who had the best chance of winning the presidency, or of the nomination, only when he got the support of the Christian Zionists at a particular point in the primary race, and it was their support that got him to that point where he was the favorite. So Pompeo, being a Christian Zionist, is a key factor here in his being promoted to become Secretary of State, where of course he is in a position to advocate for the interests of Israel, not just for the interests of Israel, but indeed for the point of view that a war in Israel could bring about the rapture, the end times, the moment when history ends and all believers are going to go to heaven, and everyone else, well, we know what's going to happen to them. So Pompeo's role in this does appear to be related to his being a leading figure politically, representing the Christian Zionist movement, and Trump's real dependence on their support. Unfortunately, I think that's a serious problem in terms of American foreign policy, because he is motivated, it appears, to push Trump in the direction of, at the very least, risking war, if not wanting him to actually pull the trigger for a war against Iran. Now, in the case of Bolton, it's a matter that Bolton is very close to the billionaire casino magnate Sheldon Adelson, who also happens to be, of course, one of the wealthiest donors to the Netanyahu campaign in the past, and a very strong supporter of the right-wing Zionist Likud movement. He's one of the most extremist people within the orbit of Trump in terms of his attitude towards Iran. I mean, he once said, only half joking, it appears, that this was just a few years ago. He said, what should happen is that we should drop a bomb on the desert in Iran as a warning to the government there. This is what will happen to you if you don't sort of straighten up and do what we demand. So Adelson was the real backer behind Bolton. He was the one who was known to support his candidacy to become National Security Advisor. In fact, Bolton actually called Trump at a crucial moment in his decision-making on Iran policy in the spring of 2018 and dropped in the suggestion that he insist in his speech that he was planning for, that he would say, I have the absolute right at any time to just pull out of this Iran nuclear deal. And that's exactly, of course, what Trump ended up saying in his speech and actually doing. So I think that's the other side of the story, having to do with Bolton.
Gareth, what are we to make of the Iran nuclear deal? I mean, it was just recently that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was on Twitter complaining about Iran enriching uranium to pre-deal levels. But what is the status of this deal, and should we be concerned? I mean, of course, it appears somebody's trying to give us the impression that, my gosh, they're building a bomb and they're going to use it any moment.
Right. No, you're absolutely correct that is the impression that one could easily get from sort of reading the headlines and the leads and even the stories for most of the coverage on this issue recently. Indeed, that is a pattern that goes back many, many years. And in fact, you mentioned my book, Manufactured Crisis. It's a book about the false history, the false narrative that surrounds the Iranian nuclear program. I did about 6 years of research went into that book. I mean, not every moment or every day, every hour of every day of my work was devoted to it, but that was during 6 years that I was doing the research for the book. And what I discovered was that there is no truth to the narrative that was built up over literally decades, beginning in the early 1990s, about Iran wanting to get nuclear weapons. In fact, this is the real heart of the matter. And so I want to sort of make this point at the outset before I go back to explaining the specifics of your question. If you go back to the early 1990s, the United States was asserting that Iran really wants to have nuclear weapons, and we mustn't let them have even a peaceful nuclear program. And that was a decade, or not quite a decade, after the Reagan administration had originally essentially cut off all cooperation with the Iranian nuclear program, which was in its infancy. I mean, really, it consisted of having just one nuclear reactor that the Shah of Iran had been bequeathed, had when he was the U.S. ally in Iran, and which the U.S. government had said, there's no reason why the Shah shouldn't go ahead and have a peaceful nuclear program. And so the U.S. government tried to cut off access to any technology or even any help in repairing this damaged nuclear reactor, because the Iraqis had damaged it during the Iran-Iraq War. And this was a violation. This is a key point that hardly anybody is aware of. This policy on the part of the United States was a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, of course, Iran was a member of, one of the original members of. And part of that treaty, a key part of it, was that every signatory to that treaty has an inherent right an inalienable right was the term that was used in the treaty, to access to have access to the technology for a peaceful nuclear program. And so there was absolutely no excuse for it. The United States wasn't claiming that Iran was trying to get nuclear weapons, or much less that there was any evidence that they actually had done anything to obtain a nuclear weapon. They simply did not want them to have access because they were on the wrong side of the Iran-Iraq war. The United States was supporting Iraq. So this was the origin of this whole problem, that the United States had forbidden peaceful nuclear power for Iran under the Islamic Republic without any reason whatsoever and in violation of the NPT. And the Iranians, of course, they weren't going to agree with that. And so they went to the market, to the international market, which was obviously perfectly legal for them to do, to obtain the independent means of enriching uranium, which is what they did in the 1980s and early 1990s. So that was the origin of their being able to enrich uranium. There's much more to the story, but I must sort of cut it off there and then bring it up to date. The Bush administration and the Obama administration both endorsed fully the idea that Iran was trying to get nuclear weapons, even though there was no evidence of this. And indeed, the claimed evidence, the asserted evidence for this, I show in my book, was really fabricated a set of documents that ultimately came through the Mujahideen Khalq, this anti-regime Iranian terrorist organization that had killed Americans many years earlier. And ultimately, it came from Israel. The Israelis, of course, have the biggest chip on their shoulder about Iran. They have the biggest motive for having fabricated documents in order to convince the world, particularly the United States, that Iran wanted nuclear weapons. So that, in a nutshell, is the background to this. And the Obama administration negotiated the agreement on this false assumption that Iran was determined to get nuclear weapons. And they included in the agreement all kinds of assurances that Iran could not possibly get away with any covert enrichment of uranium. There's extremely tight set of provisions that have lots of ways in which Iran is under surveillance. And so from that point of view, it's a very tight agreement. And the people who were telling Trump, oh, you must get out of this agreement, are motivated not by real evidence of an Iranian nuclear weapons ambition, but rather by an ideological standpoint and interest that has nothing to do with the actual evidence.
Gareth,
and that is a nutshell.
I recall, it was probably about a couple years ago, I encountered a documentary by Rick Steves, very renowned travel, I don't know what you would call him, advisor. He has an empire of writing these travel guides and many documentaries and TV shows showing him going to different countries and what it's like to experience those cultures and climates. And he did an hour-long documentary. In fact, he posted it, the full-length documentary, to YouTube. I will encourage all of our listeners, if you're at all curious about Iran, it was mind-opening for me to watch this. We'll link to it at the show notes page. Again, today, that's societyandthestate.com/158. It was amazing because he was going around. Yeah, he was, guarded and watched over by Iranian government officials to make sure that he, wasn't saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. But over and over again, he was encountering people who were saying, we love America. We love Western culture. We love you guys. Hey, let's talk. You're amazing. Let's be friends. And I was so struck by that because it is so counter to the narrative that we are given to fuel and foment this war, or potential war, that these are all horrible people and they're funding and fueling terrorism and we should just raise the whole country to the ground. And here's Rick Steves showing culture and history and artifacts and museums and people who have brothers and sisters and moms and dads and kids and they're like, yeah, our governments don't like one another, but we love America and we love you. And it was really fascinating to me. My question is this.
No, this is, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Gareth. My question is, are we being fed this kind of boy who cries wolf, where over and over again we're fed this line of they're terrorism, they're evil, they want nuclear weapons so they can destroy Israel, and that's the end of the story. It seems to me that the narrative is so disconnected from the reality on the ground and kind of the broader context. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, in general, I would certainly agree with your conclusion. The narrative is really over the top on the whole subject of Iran. And this is for a variety of reasons. It's not just a single reason that this is the case. In my book, I explain the two major factors that have shaped U.S. policy over the last 2 or 3 decades toward Iran. One key factor here is the interest of the national security state of the United States. It's no accident that the key turning point in U.S. policy on this question of an Iran nuclear weapon, the idea that Iran wanted to have nuclear weapons was in the early 1990s. That's when the Cold War had just ended, and the CIA and the Pentagon needed to have a new enemy. Because they had all these, the CIA specifically had all this manpower that had been tied up with following the Soviet Union. And when there was no longer a Soviet Union and Russia was simply a shadow of its former Soviet self, and was under basically, relatively benign government, they couldn't justify the requirement that they couldn't justify the budget that they had always had during the Cold War. And so in my book, I document the fact that Robert M. Gates, who was at that moment the new director of the CIA, came up with this idea that the new equivalent of the threat that Russia had posed to the United States was the threat of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and that the poster country, if you will, for that threat was none other than Iran. And so Gates was focusing in on Iran as the new threat to have nuclear weapons. And he went so far, and I show this in my book, I document this in the book, that he publicly claimed that there was evidence that Iran wanted nuclear weapons, that they were working towards nuclear weapons, just at the very moment when his analysts had finished a national intelligence estimate that suggested the opposite, that there was no evidence that Iran was really working on nuclear weapons, that their nuclear program was in its infancy, that they didn't draw any such conclusion. So, this is just by way of pointing out that there is this bureaucratic interest in citing this threat as a way of justifying the sort of Cold War level of budget and manpower. And the same thing is true for the Pentagon. In fact, I cite evidence that the Pentagon quite deliberately blew up the idea that Iran was going to emerge as a military power in the region at a time when, of course, there were no such thing. And this, again, is simply another emanation of the same problem, that these powerful bureaucracies were used to Cold War levels of funding, and without a new threat, they couldn't justify it. So that's one source of this very strong tendency to find that Iran was really threatening to get nuclear weapons. The other side of it, however, was the relationship between the United States and Israel. And the Israeli government, particularly beginning with the Labor government in 1993, when it was first elected, had made a decision that they were to demonize Iran and regard Iran as the major new threat to Israel. An existential threat is what it was called. And the argument was pushed very strongly by the Israeli government with the United States that they should together work on preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And so the Clinton administration, Clinton running for president, wanted to show that he was strongly pro-Israeli, more pro-Israeli than his competitor. And so he was fully engaged with cooperation with Israel on this question. And so the Israelis have had a pervasive influence on U.S. policy toward Iran ever since then. And that is the big part of the story as to how this notion that Iran was in fact working covertly on nuclear weapons came about. And I document again all that entire story in detail in my book.
We'll link to that. Gareth, I apologize. We got to wrap it up. But as I indicated, we will link to that book along with an article. And this is how I first encountered you and reached out to you. In antiwar.com, you have an article recently published titled No War with Iran for Now, but Mike Pompeo and John Bolton still really, really want one. And then your subtitle, which I love that. That's a good, effective marketing title. But the subtitle says, Trump's war hawks have been cooking up war with Iran for at least a year, but much of their evidence is nonsense. So important to understand these things. Brian and I talk about them, but folks like you are really doing the investigative work to really peel back the lies and the claims and really help people understand truth. And so that article, your book, and the Rick Steves documentary that we discussed will be on today's show notes page, societyandthestate.com/158. Gareth Porter is an investigative journalist, historian, and we'll link to the book as well, Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare. Check out the show notes page. Gareth Porter, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.